moment, I'd like to introduce Dr. Wayne Wiatt.
I think Scott did that. Someone was sharing with me in our prayer time before that they had this image of Scott in the African bush wearing a loincloth and a spear. And I didn't doubt it. It was, probably is true. So I do hope you're praying for him. That is a great mission project, Panua. I've been involved in another similar mission project in Africa called Zoe Ministries, which takes underserved children who are orphaned through no fault of their own, sometimes through genocide in Africa and other times through the pandemic of AIDS, and who are living as orphans, often in the jungle, and bringing them together in a way in which they are cared for, and they want to stay together as families. So I know that this project that Scott is becoming a part of is a wonderful way to help children stay together in a third world place with care and grace. And so I'm so glad that he's a part of that. My challenge this morning, and really my joy, is to share with you what it means to consider answering a call to ordained ministry. And in my thinking about that, I selected a passage from 1 Kings, the 19th chapter, beginning in verse 11. Hear these words. The Lord said, "Go out and stand at the mountain before the Lord. The Lord is passing by." A very strong wind tore through the mountain and broke apart the stones before the Lord. But the Lord wasn't in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord wasn't in the fire. And after the fire, there was a sound, thin, quiet. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his coat. He went out and stood at the cave's entrance. And a voice came to him and said, "Why are you here, Elijah? Why are you here?" In 1975, I was 20 years old. It was a long time ago. And I was asking myself that same question, why am I here? Maybe you've been there at a particular point in your life. I was sitting in a church pew in Valdosta, Georgia. My parents had signed up for some crazy event called Pack the Pew. And it was during an old Bowden-Souter revival crusade in which they had to pack the pew with folks. So, of course, they tapped their 4 children first and other friends. And my dad was on one end, my mother was on the end, and we could not escape. And I thought to myself, why am I here? It was against everything I didn't believe in. The preaching was loud, the hymns were too many, until I wanted to be anywhere but sandwiched in that pew between my mother and father at that revival at First United Methodist Church in Valdosta, Georgia. But in spite of those obstacles, I still heard the voice. In spite of myself, I still heard the voice. Thin, quiet, underneath the singing and the organ and piano accompaniment, underneath the evangelistic fervor of the evening, I still heard the voice. It was as if someone behind me suddenly gently nudged me forward. And I felt as if I fell out of the pew that evening. And the voice said, "Get up, go." And I did. I was listening, you see. Listening. One of the first things we have to do to hear God speak is to listen to his voice. Listen to God's still, small voice. Listening is probably one of the most difficult things we do as human beings. We are overconnected to our devices, aren't we? Here I am with my iPad up here. You imagine you have an iPad in your home or computer or an iPhone on you even this morning, or some sort of mobile device. And we're connected almost all the time, whether we like it or not. I get dismayed when I go in a restaurant and I see a family sitting together and they're all hooked up rather than listening to each other. Before iPhones and this plugged-in generation, I can remember a time when my daughter Taylor was about 2 or 3, and I was busy watching TV or reading the paper, and suddenly she climbed up in my lap and she grabbed my face with her 2 little hands, and she looked me straight in the eye, nose to nose, eyeball to eyeball, and she said, "Listen, Daddy, listen to me." We all need to be heard. We all want to be listened to. People sometimes spend thousands of dollars to go to a counselor or a therapist to simply have someone give them their undivided attention, to listen and help them work through issues in their lives. To hear God's call upon our lives like Elijah, we have to listen. We need to put ourselves in a posture, in a place where we can listen. For Elijah, it was a mountaintop experience, much like Moses. It was being in a place even where there were obstacles indeed to overcome, wind, fire, even an earthquake. But to get ourselves into a place where we can hear God speaking sometimes is difficult. It's as if God reached down and gently put his hands upon Elijah's face and said, "Listen, Elijah, listen to me." Elijah had to overcome a lot. The prophets of Baal, the fact that the other prophets had been killed. He was the only one left and the only one that still felt a sense of answering God's call upon his life. And then after a call comes a time of discernment. We need to be able to discern what God is asking us to do. I go back time and time again to that experience in that pew in First United Methodist Church of Valdosta, Georgia, and being literally, I felt, in memory, kicked out of the pew down to the altar. And I knew that it was different than my confirmation experience, where I had grown up in the church and accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior. This was different. It was different than the time I was immersed in the Atlantic Ocean just down the street when I was on a youth retreat at age 17. And we came to Daytona Beach, and I felt this need in my teenage years to recommit my life to Christ. And I did so by being immersed and remembering my baptism. But this was different that night. It was a time where, in the midst of everything else going on around me, I listened to that still voice of God. That was a call. A call to serve Christ, a call to some kind of ministry in the church. I wasn't exactly sure at that time, but it was a call to give my life to serve God. I was a music major, and so I thought, well, maybe that meant I'm to serve God through music, and that's what I'll do as a ministry. And so I majored in sacred music and began to focus my thoughts towards being a church musician. But as I began to discern that call in my life, it was more than that. It was that, but more than that. It was a more specific to ordained ministry. And so I spent the summer being a youth intern at Trinity United Methodist Church in Tallahassee. where, interestingly enough, Phil Roughton, one of your former pastors, was a brand new associate there out of seminary. Gene Zimmerman, who is a sage mentor and pastor in this conference, was the senior pastor, and John Green, education pastor, was another one on staff. And through their mentorship and through their interest in me, I began to discern and develop this call to ministry. Youth director, already doing that. Music, possibility. But finally, with the encouragement of Phil and Gene, Gene Zimmerman asked me one day this question. He said, "Wayne, have you ever considered ordained ministry? Have you ever considered being a minister in the church? Like me, like Phil, like John?" And I had not. And it took someone asking me that question for me to sort of redirect my path and move towards serving the church full time. Well, I thought I would never pass seminary. I'm not smart enough, I said. I gave myself a lot of excuses. But I did. Somehow I didn't flunk out. Somehow I even managed to finish another degree along the way. And even though I couldn't sit still for very long, I said I can never do all the reading that it takes to graduate seminary. I learned how to adapt my learning style, and I was able to finish. And by the grace of God, here I am, not only an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church, I've been a pastor, a district superintendent. Now I'm serving the conference through helping others discern and claim their call to ministry through the Office of Clergy Excellence. My joy is helping other young men and women discern that call. Caitlin Booth, your very own, is in the process of discerning that call and will meet with your SPRC and staff parish, and then before the charge conference. Rachel Smith DeLawn, another